The water was black as oil beneath the winter sky. Lieutenant Hans Krieger pressed his face against the cold rubber eyepiece of the periscope, scanning the horizon through the narrow window of U-507. Around him, the submarine's interior dripped with condensation, water that ran down rusted pipes and pooled in the bilges, mixing with diesel fuel and the stale sweat of 40 men who hadn't seen daylight in 3 weeks. The air was thick, suffocating, tasting of unwashed bodies and machine grease. But none of that mattered now. Through the lens, Krieger could see them. 3 merchant ships crawling across the gray Atlantic like wounded cattle, silhouettes dark against the pale dawn. Easy targets. The kind that had made him an ace, the kind that would soon cease to exist. He called out the coordinates quietly, almost reverently. This was the moment the Kriegsmarine had trained him for, the moment that Admiral Dönitz had promised would bring Britain to its knees. Sever the convoy routes, starve the island, win the war from beneath the waves. For months it had been working. German U-boats had been bleeding the Allied merchant fleet dry, sending millions of tons of cargo to the bottom of the Atlantic. Each sinking was a victory, each torpedo a step closer to forcing Churchill to the negotiating table. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Sink ships faster than the enemy could build them. And in early 1942, Germany was winning that equation. Krieger gave the order. The torpedo bay doors opened with a hydraulic hiss. The calculations were automatic now, muscle memory honed through dozens of kills. Distance, speed, lead time. The Type 7 U-boat shuddered as compressed air launched the first eel into the darkness, then the second, then the third. Krieger counted silently, watching through the periscope as the white wakes arrowed toward their targets. 20 seconds. 30, 41 seconds, and the ocean erupted. The first freighter buckled amidships, a column of flame climbing into the morning sky. The second explosion followed 8 seconds later. Men were dying up there, Krieger knew, burning in oil fires or drowning in water cold enough to stop a heart in minutes. But he felt nothing except professional satisfaction. This was total war. This was what victory looked like. What Hans Krieger could not see, what no one in the Kriegsmarine could yet see, was that he was not witnessing the height of German naval power. He was watching its last sunrise. Across the Atlantic, in shipyards that stretched from Maine to California, in industrial cities that Krieger had never heard of and could not imagine, a transformation was already underway. A transformation that would render his skill, his courage, his deadly efficiency utterly meaningless. America was about to perform an industrial miracle that would rewrite the rules of maritime warfare and drown the U-boat threat in a steel flood that no amount of German tactical brilliance could ever overcome. The Battle of the Atlantic began long before the first shot was fired. It began in the strategic calculations of the German Naval High Command, in the doctrine of unrestricted submarine warfare that had nearly starved Britain in the First World War. When Adolf Hitler launched his war of conquest across Europe, he inherited a naval problem. Britain was an island. Everything it needed to survive, food, fuel, ammunition, troops, had to cross the ocean. And oceans could be controlled not by great battleships, which were expensive and vulnerable, but by submarines. Cheap, deadly, nearly invisible submarines that could strike without warning and vanish into the depths. Admiral Karl Dönitz understood this perfectly. He calculated that if Germany could sink 750,000 tons of Allied shipping every month, Britain would collapse within a year. Not through invasion, not through aerial bombardment, simply through starvation and economic strangulation. For nearly 3 years, Dönitz came terrifyingly close to proving himself right. The numbers told a story of devastation. In 1940, U-boats sank 471 Allied ships.
In 1941, 432 more. In the first 6 months of 1942, the period submariners would later call the happy time, German submarines operated with near impunity along the American coast, sinking vessels faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. Tankers burned like torches off the beaches of Florida. Freighters went down within sight of New York. Bodies washed ashore in North Carolina. The American entry into the war, far from turning the tide, had simply provided more targets. U-boat commanders racked up kill counts that would have seemed impossible in any previous conflict. A single submarine could sink a dozen ships in a single patrol. The Atlantic had become a shooting gallery, and the hunters wore the gray uniforms of the Kriegsmarine.
The German submariners believed they were invincible. They had reason to believe it. Their Type 7 U-boats were technological marvels, cramped, dangerous, claustrophobic coffins, perhaps, but also the most effective commerce raiders ever designed. They could dive to 220 meters, run submerged for days, and surface to rake convoys with deck guns before slipping back beneath the waves. The men who crewed them were an elite, volunteers who wore their silver dolphin badges with fierce pride. They were hunters, predators, the tip of Germany's strategic spear. In the officers' messes of the submarine pens at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, the mood was confident, almost cocky. The Allies were building ships, yes, but not fast enough, never fast enough. The mathematics remained on Germany's side. But mathematics could change, and in the spring of 1941, 18 months before Krieger sent those 3 ships to the bottom, an obscure American industrialist named Henry J. Kaiser had walked into a meeting in Washington with a proposal that sounded like fantasy. He claimed he could build a 10,000-ton cargo ship, a vessel that normally required a year of skilled labor, in less than 4 months. Not one ship, hundreds of ships, thousands of ships. He would do it by abandoning every traditional shipbuilding technique, by treating the construction of ocean-going vessels not as a craft, but as an assembly line problem. Prefabricated sections, welding instead of riveting, modular construction, mass production applied to ships the way Henry Ford had applied it to automobiles. The shipbuilding experts, the men who had spent careers learning the ancient art of naval architecture, laughed at him. Ships could not be built that way. The stresses were too great. The welds would fail. The vessels would break apart in heavy seas. Kaiser proved them wrong with a fury that bordered on violence. He built 18 shipyards up and down the west and east coasts. He hired workers who had never seen a ship before, farmers, housewives, teenagers, anyone with 2 hands and a willingness to work. He broke down the construction process into simple, repeatable tasks that could be learned in days. He erected massive cranes that could lift entire prefabricated deck houses and drop them into place. He instituted 3 shifts, 24-hour production, a pace that never stopped. And on September 27, 1941, just 244 days after the keel was laid, the SS Patrick Henry slid down the ways in Baltimore, the first Liberty ship, the prototype of an armada. She was ugly, even her builders admitted that. With her slab sides, blunt bow, and ungainly superstructure, the Liberty ship looked like a floating shoebox, utilitarian, graceless, purely functional. Franklin Roosevelt, speaking at the Patrick Henry's launch, tried to dress up the moment with poetry, calling these vessels ugly ducklings that would nevertheless carry the fight across the Atlantic. The nickname stuck, ugly ducklings. But ugliness didn't matter. Speed of construction mattered, cost mattered, and above all, numbers mattered, because Henry Kaiser had discovered something that would change the war. He could build ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The production numbers began modestly, but they grew with terrifying momentum. In 1941, American shipyards launched 30 Liberty ships. In 1942, the number jumped to 597.
By 1943, the yards were completing 3 Liberty ships every single day. Every 24 hours, 3 more 10,000-ton cargo vessels joined the merchant fleet. The yards in Richmond, California, where Kaiser's operation reached its peak efficiency, shattered every record. The SS Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch, a feat that made headlines around the world and sent shockwaves through German naval intelligence. 4 days! A ship capable of carrying 9,000 tons of cargo across an ocean, built faster than most families could plan a vacation. But speed was only part of the miracle. The real revolution was in the numbers, in the sheer overwhelming mass production that American industrial might could achieve once fully mobilized. By the end of the war, American shipyards would launch 2,710 Liberty ships. Not variants, not across multiple classes. A single standardized design produced 2,710 times, plus hundreds more of the improved Victory-class ships that followed. Each one could carry 10,800 deadweight tons of cargo, tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything an army needed to fight on foreign soil. Do the math. 2,710 ships times 10,800 tons equals more than 29 million tons of cargo capacity. An entire navy of merchant vessels built faster than any enemy could destroy them. The German submariners did not understand what was happening at first. They could see the increase in convoy sizes, the growing number of escorts, but the strategic implication took time to penetrate. U-boat commanders still filed patrol reports claiming 5 or 6 ship kills, still painted tiny silhouettes on their conning towers to mark their victories. In the Wolfpack headquarters, Donitz still believed the campaign was on track. The tonnage numbers looked good on paper, but those numbers were lies. For every ship the U-boats sent to the bottom, 2 more were sliding down the ways in America. For every tanker torpedoed, 3 more were being welded together on the West Coast. The mathematics that had favored Germany, the brutal calculus of attrition, was reversing. And it was reversing faster than German intelligence could comprehend.
The realization came gradually, then all at once, like a creeping horror in a nightmare. U-boat patrols that had once found convoys of 8 or 10 ships now encountered fleets of 50, 60, 70 vessels sailing in massive boxes protected by escort carriers, destroyers, corvettes, and submarine hunters equipped with radar, sonar, and depth charges. The hunters were becoming the hunted. The killing grounds of the happy time transformed into graveyards for submarines. U-boats that ventured into the Atlantic hunting lanes began disappearing, not occasionally, but routinely. Of the 1,162 U-boats commissioned by the Kriegsmarine during the war, 785 would be sunk, a casualty rate of nearly 70%, the highest of any military branch in any nation during World War II. To volunteer for U-boat service became, statistically, to volunteer for death. Hans Krieger survived long enough to understand what had happened. U-507 was sunk in January 1943 by an American patrol aircraft off the coast of Brazil, depth-charged until her pressure hull imploded. Krieger was not aboard. He had been rotated to a staff position by then, promoted for his earlier successes. In the submarine pens, he watched younger men depart on patrols from which most would never return. He read the intelligence reports that grew increasingly desperate, chronicling the explosion in Allied shipping. He saw the aerial reconnaissance photographs showing American shipyards with dozens of vessels under construction simultaneously, each at a different stage of completion, the entire process moving like a vast machine. And he understood, with the cold certainty of a man who had lived by mathematics, that Germany had lost the Atlantic not through any failure of courage or skill, but through sheer industrial obliteration. The psychological impact on the U-boat force was devastating.
Submariners had entered the war as an elite, confident in their technological superiority and tactical prowess. They had expected to be the decisive arm of German naval strategy, the weapon that would win the war without armies even needing to land. What they experienced instead was technological obsolescence in real time. Allied radar that could detect a submarine's conning tower at night, sonar that could track submarines underwater, aircraft that could patrol vast areas and attack with rockets and depth charges before a U-boat could even dive. And beneath it all, always, was the knowledge that no matter how many ships they sank, more would come. Always more, an inexhaustible flood of steel and cargo pouring across the Atlantic, drowning the U-boat campaign in pure abundance. There was a peculiar cruelty in the Liberty ship's design that German naval officers came to recognize. These were not elegant vessels. They were not fast. A Liberty ship could make 11 knots on a good day, slow enough that a surfaced U-boat could outrun her. They were not even particularly well armed. Most carried a single 5-inch gun and some anti-aircraft weapons, purely defensive. They were simply numerous, individually vulnerable, collectively unstoppable. You could sink one and it would barely register as a statistical blip. Sink 10 and they would be replaced before the week was out. Sink 100 and the convoys would grow larger. The Liberty ship became a symbol, though few recognized it as such during the war. She represented something uniquely American, the application of overwhelming material abundance to a problem that others approached through skill and valor. Where German submariners trained for years to master the complex art of torpedo warfare, American welders trained for weeks and went to work. Where Germany built submarines as precision instruments, expensive, difficult to replace, crewed by elite volunteers, America built cargo ships as commodities, stamping them out with assembly line efficiency. It was a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare. Not better seamanship, not superior tactics, simply more. More steel, more ships, more cargo, more of everything, produced faster than any enemy could destroy it. There is a photograph from 1943 that captures this philosophy perfectly. It shows the Richmond shipyard in California from an aerial perspective. 7 Liberty ships are visible in the frame, all in various stages of construction. Massive cranes tower over the yards. Thousands of workers swarm across the vessels like ants building a colony. And in the background, you can see the slipways extending into San Francisco Bay, where more hulls are being prepared. The photograph is in black and white, grainy, but the sense of scale is overwhelming. This is not a shipyard. This is an industrial cathedral, a temple to mass production, a monument to the idea that quantity has a quality all its own. For the men aboard U-boats who managed to return from late-war patrols, and fewer did, the psychological toll was immense. They had done everything right. They had been brave. They had been skilled. They had sunk ships, and none of it mattered. The convoys kept coming, larger every month, better defended, more confident. The iron logic of attrition that Donitz had relied upon had reversed itself. Now Germany was losing submarines faster than they could be built, while Allied merchant tonnage grew monthly. The hunters had become the hunted, but worse than that, they had become irrelevant. The Battle of the Atlantic was being won not by destroyers or aircraft carriers or tactical innovations, but by welders in California and Baltimore and Portland, by workers who would never see combat, but who were drowning the U-boat force in ships they built faster than any submarine could find them.
The turning point, the moment when even the German Naval High Command had to acknowledge defeat, came in May 1943. That month, Donitz lost 41 U-boats, 41 submarines, representing more than 2,000 trained submariners, gone in 30 days. The losses were unsustainable, catastrophic. On May 24th, Donitz ordered his remaining U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The signal was coded, but its meaning was clear. We have lost.
The wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic for 3 years retreated to Norwegian waters and the Bay of Biscay, where they would spend the rest of the war in increasingly desperate defensive operations. The Battle of the Atlantic was over. Germany had not been outfought, it had been outbuilt. The Liberty ships sailed on. By 1944, they were everywhere, in every theater, carrying every conceivable type of cargo. They hauled tanks to North Africa, ammunition to Italy, food to Britain, troops to France. They sailed to Murmansk on the nightmare convoys to Russia, where German submarines and aircraft still hunted in the Arctic darkness. They crossed the Pacific, supplying the island-hopping campaign against Japan. Some were converted to troop transports, hospital ships, repair vessels. Several were deliberately scuttled to form breakwaters during the D-Day landings, expendable even in that role because they were always more. More than 200 Liberty ships were lost during the war to submarines, aircraft, mines, and storms, and none of it mattered. The production lines simply built more. There's a particular sound that veterans of the Liberty ships remember, a sound that German submariners came to dread when they heard it through their hydrophones. It was the sound of massed propellers, dozens of ships churning through the water in formation, a deep thrumming vibration that carried for miles underwater. Not the high-pitched whine of destroyers or the powerful beat of battleship screws, but this lower, steadier sound, the sound of cargo ships in convoy. It was the sound of inevitability, the sound of an industrial power that had geared its entire economy for war and was now delivering the products of that economy across an ocean. German submariners, hiding at depth while convoys passed overhead, would listen to that sound for hours sometimes, counting the individual ships by their propeller beats. 10 ships, 20, 30, 40. After a while, they stopped counting. The symbolic power of the Liberty ship extended beyond mere numbers. These vessels carried in their holds the proof of American abundance, not just weapons and ammunition, but food. Vast quantities of food, canned meat, powdered milk, flour, sugar, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, luxuries that had disappeared from European markets years ago, arrived in American cargo ships by the ton. British housewives who had endured years of rationing could suddenly obtain Spam and canned peaches, courtesy of Lend-Lease. Soviet soldiers ate American stew from cans labeled in English. Even the German military, when it captured Allied supply dumps, was shocked by the sheer variety and quantity of provisions. German rations by 1944 had been reduced to black bread and ersatz coffee. American soldiers ate fresh meat, white bread, and real coffee, with chocolate bars and cigarettes so abundant they were used as currency. This disparity, this gross, overwhelming abundance on one side and increasing deprivation on the other, represented more than logistics. It represented competing visions of industrial civilization. Germany had mobilized for war with tremendous efficiency, organizing its economy along totalitarian lines, extracting maximum output from slave labor and occupied territories. And still, Germany could not match American production. The United States, entering the war later, mobilizing more slowly, hampered by democratic debate and labor negotiations, still managed to outproduce the Axis powers in every category. More ships, more planes, more tanks, more guns, more ammunition, more food. The comparison was not even close. By 1944, American industrial output exceeded the combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy. This was the arithmetic that doomed the Axis more surely than any battlefield victory.
By February 1943, when Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal, the sniper dynamic had completely reversed. American counter-sniper teams operated with such effectiveness that Japanese soldiers stopped volunteering for sniper assignments. Positions that had once been sought after as opportunities for individual glory became recognized as suicide missions. The soundscape of the jungle had changed. Where once Japanese snipers had created an environment of unpredictable terror through their careful, patient shots, now the crack of Springfield rifles represented something else, the methodical, inevitable working of an American system that had adapted, evolved, and learned to beat the Japanese at their own tactical specialty. The statistics tell part of the story. In August 1942, Japanese snipers achieved an average of 7.3 casualties per sniper before being killed or forced to withdraw. By January 1943, that ratio had declined to 1.4 casualties per sniper. Conversely, American counter-sniper teams achieved an average of 4.2 confirmed enemy sniper eliminations per team during their operational period. But statistics cannot capture the psychological transformation. Private First Class Robert Leckie, who survived Guadalcanal and wrote movingly about the experience, described hearing Springfield fire in late December 1942. The sound was different from other weapons. The M1 Garand made a sharp, quick crack, the sound of American industrial firepower, fast and efficient. The Springfield made a heavier, more deliberate sound, slower, more patient. When you heard that sound, you knew someone had taken time to aim, to calculate, to make the shot matter. It was the sound of someone who was not afraid, who was not panicking, who was hunting with the calm certainty of someone who knew they were better at this than the enemy. That sound restored something the jungle had taken from us, the confidence that we could master this environment rather than simply endure it. The Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal in February 1943 was publicly described as a tactical withdrawal, but internal Japanese military assessments told a different story. The island had become untenable not primarily because of American numbers or material superiority, though both were factors, but because American forces had demonstrated the ability to match and exceed Japanese excellence in the specialized warfare that Japanese doctrine had predicted would decisively favor Japan. Colonel Matsuda Masao, who served as operations officer for the 17th Army on Guadalcanal, wrote in his post-evacuation report, "We entered this campaign with confidence that American troops, products of soft living and democratic individualism, would break under the patient pressure of jungle warfare. Instead, we observed the Americans transform themselves systematically. They studied our tactics, adapted their responses, and developed countermeasures that exploited our methods against us. The American sniper program, in particular, demonstrated something we had not credited, that American society, for all its material luxury, could produce soldiers with patience, discipline, and dedication equal to our own. This was not the enemy we had prepared to fight." The Springfield rifles that Marine snipers carried through the jungles of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and eventually Okinawa remain in museums now, their wooden stocks worn smooth by hands that steadied them through shots that mattered more than the shooters could know at the time. They are relics of a transformation that occurred not in Pentagon planning rooms, but in the space between heartbeats, as men who had been trained for industrial warfare learned to fight with pre-industrial patience, armed with industrial-age precision. There is poetry in the final accounting, though it is the poetry of ledgers and production figures rather than songs and stories. German shipyards produced 1,162 U-boats during World War II, an impressive feat of engineering and organization. American shipyards produced 2,710 Liberty ships, plus 414 Victory ships, plus hundreds of escort carriers and destroyer escorts and fleet auxiliaries. The comparison speaks for itself. For every U-boat that Germany could build, America built 2 merchant ships to replace the ones that U-boat would sink, plus enough warships to hunt that U-boat down and destroy it. This was not war as the German military understood it, as a contest of will and skill and tactical genius. This was industrial warfare, where victory went not to the boldest or the bravest, but to whoever could marshal more resources and deploy them more efficiently. The legacy of the Liberty ship extends far beyond military history. These vessels demonstrated that the right kind of mass production could solve problems previously thought impossible. They showed that American industrial capitalism, for all its chaos and inefficiency, could achieve miracles of coordination when necessary. They proved that democracy and abundance were not weaknesses, but strategic advantages. And they established a template for how America would fight its wars afterward, not through elegant tactics or professional expertise alone, but through overwhelming material superiority. The Liberty ship philosophy, build more, build faster, bury the enemy in resources he cannot match, would echo through Korea, Vietnam, and every subsequent conflict. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic was won not by the men who fought it, but by the women and men who welded and riveted and built in shipyards thousands of miles from the combat, by the workers at Richmond and Baltimore and Portland who probably never saw a German submarine and never heard a torpedo explode, but whose labor decided the war as surely as any admiral or general. They built ugly ships, ungraceful ships, cheap ships that sometimes broke in half in heavy seas, but they built enough of them to change history. They built so many that the most skilled, dedicated, courageous submarine force ever assembled could not stop them. They built a steel flood that carried democracy and abundance across the Atlantic, drowning dictatorship in cargo holds full of food and weapons, and proof that free societies, when tested, possess resources that tyrannies cannot match and cannot comprehend. Hans Krieger, the U-boat ace who survived the war, lived until 1987. In interviews late in his life, he would speak with lingering respect about the men he fought against, the destroyer captains and convoy escorts who learned to hunt submarines with increasing skill. But when asked about why Germany lost the Battle of the Atlantic, his answer was always the same and always tinged with a kind of bewildered awe. The ships, he would say. They just kept building ships. No matter how many we sank, there were always more, always more. He died in Hamburg, not far from the submarine pens where his war had begun, in a Germany that had been rebuilt by the same American industrial power that had defeated it. The ugly ducklings had won, not through beauty, not through grace, but through the simple, overwhelming, irresistible power of more.